Hey guys, tonight we begin with some of the most famous medieval figures you've probably heard of. Legendary popes, fearless outlaws, dragon slayers, heroic kings. The Middle Ages were many things: chaotic, dramatic, deeply symbolic. But above all, they were very comfortable blurring the line between "this happened" and "this makes a great story." So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Let's begin with one of the most persistent medieval legends ever told: Pope Joan. According to the story, sometime in the 9th century, a brilliant young woman disguised herself as a man in order to study theology. Apparently, medieval Europe had two problems: limited opportunities for women, and absolutely no background checks. She was so intelligent, so articulate, and so convincing that she rose through the ranks of the church hierarchy, eventually becoming pope. Yes, pope. Not assistant pope, not junior monk, the top job. And for a while, everything allegedly went smoothly. She delivered sermons, wrote theological opinions, governed Christendom. Nobody noticed anything unusual, which, if true, would make it one of the most successful undercover operations in history. Then comes the part medieval storytellers clearly enjoyed the most. During a grand public procession through Rome, very ceremonial, very dignified, lots of robes, Pope Joan suddenly goes into labour and gives birth in the street. Which is, objectively, a bold way to reveal you have been living a double life. In some versions of the legend, she dies immediately. In others, the crowd reacts violently. Either way, it ends dramatically. Medieval writers were not fans of subtle conclusions. Now here is the less dramatic reality. There is absolutely no contemporary evidence that Pope Joan ever existed. None. The story first appears in written form in the 13th century, about 400 years after she supposedly reigned. Medieval papal records from the 9th century are surprisingly thorough. There is no mysterious missing pope, no awkward 2-year blank labelled, "We don't talk about that one." It is simply not there. So where did the story come from? Most historians believe it likely began as satire or anti-papal propaganda. The medieval church was powerful, wealthy, and not universally loved. Creating a story in which it was humiliated by its own leadership, that spreads nicely. It is scandalous. It is symbolic. It is memorable, and medieval audiences loved a good scandal. What makes Pope Joan fascinating is not that she probably never existed. It is that for centuries, educated people believed she did. Pilgrims were shown supposed evidence. Later, church rituals were retroactively explained as safeguards against another Joan. Chroniclers repeated the tale confidently, and confidence apparently was all it took. Pope Joan may never have ruled Rome, but she absolutely ruled medieval gossip, which, if we are being honest, might be even more powerful. Now we move from papal scandal to national obsession. King Arthur, the once and future king, wielder of Excalibur, leader of the Knights of the Round Table, owner of the most famous piece of furniture in medieval literature: Camelot, Merlin, Lancelot, Guinevere, epic battles, betrayal, destiny. It feels historical. It feels ancient. It feels foundational. There's just one small problem. The version of Arthur most people imagine is largely the result of 12th century creative writing. Early references to an Arthur appear in sources written centuries after the time he supposedly lived, around the 5th or 6th century. These early mentions are brief and vague. They describe a warrior, maybe a leader, possibly Romano-British, not a crowned king with a wizard advisor and a sword chosen by fate. Then, in the 12th century, Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote The History of the Kings of Britain, and Arthur went from local war hero to cinematic universe. Geoffrey presented his account as history. He described Arthur conquering vast territories, defeating enemies across Europe, and ruling with unmatched glory. It was compelling. It was detailed. It was very popular. It was also, by modern standards, wildly unreliable. Later writers expanded the myth even further. French romances added chivalry, romance, mystical quests, and the Holy Grail. Suddenly, Arthur wasn't just a leader, he was the centerpiece of a moral universe. And once a story gets that big, it stops needing evidence. Historians today generally agree that if a historical Arthur existed at all, he was likely a minor post-Roman military leader whose story grew in the telling. But the Arthur we picture, the shining king of Camelot, that's literary evolution at work. And here's the fascinating part. Arthur may not have been historically real in the way people assume, but his myth shaped real politics, real identity, real nationalism. English and Welsh rulers referenced him. Tudor monarchs linked themselves to him. Entire generations believed he would return in Britain's darkest hour. That's impressive. To possibly not exist, and still become a cornerstone of cultural identity. Arthur may be historically blurry, but as a brand, flawless. Medieval writers did not just create a king. They created a legend so powerful that questioning it still feels slightly rebellious, which, honestly, is legendary behaviour for someone who may never have lived. Now from kings of Camelot to kings of tax evasion. Robin Hood, the noble outlaw of Sherwood Forest, the man who robbed the rich and gave to the poor, the medieval embodiment of eat the elite, but with better archery skills. Green tights, longbow, loyal band of merry men, a corrupt sheriff, a romantic tension with Maid Marian. It feels historical. It feels grounded. It feels like someone you might accidentally run into if you get lost in the wrong forest. Except there is no solid evidence that a single, identifiable Robin Hood ever existed. The earliest surviving ballads about him appear in the 15th century, centuries after the period he is supposed to have lived. And in those early ballads, he is not even consistently noble. Sometimes he is generous. Sometimes he is just aggressively anti-authority, which, to be fair, was relatable. Here is where things get interesting. Robin Hood may not have been a name at all. It may have been a nickname, or even a generic label, used for outlaws. In medieval legal records, variations of the name appear attached to different criminals across different regions. Translation: Robin Hood might have meant something like local forest-based problem, not one heroic man, possibly several criminals, possibly none of them particularly charitable. But over time, ballads shaped him into a symbol, a champion of the poor, a rebel against unjust taxation, a folk hero who stood against corrupt authority. And that image stuck. Writers kept polishing him. Later versions tied him to specific kings, specific rebellions, specific historical contexts. The more details added, the more real he felt. And once a story aligns with people's sense of justice, it becomes untouchable. Did medieval peasants need a real Robin Hood? Not necessarily. They needed the idea of one. Someone out there balancing the scales. Someone humiliating the powerful. Someone making tax collectors nervous. Robin Hood may not have existed as one historical person, but as a symbol, he was unstoppable. And in a way, that is more durable than reality. Because real outlaws fade. Legends keep shooting arrows. Now we leave English forests and head into something far more ambitious. A global king, Prester John. According to medieval Europeans, somewhere in the mysterious East there existed a powerful Christian monarch ruling a vast, wealthy kingdom filled with wonders. Rivers of gems, exotic creatures, endless armies, advanced cities. Basically a medieval travel brochure written by someone who had never travelled. And this king, he was Christian, which, during the Crusades, sounded extremely convenient. The legend began circulating in the 12th century. Letters allegedly written by Prester John himself appeared in Europe, describing his magnificent realm. The letters were copied, translated, and widely distributed. There was just one small detail. The kingdom kept moving. At first, people thought Prester John ruled somewhere in India, then Central Asia, later Ethiopia. Every time geography became inconvenient, the legend politely relocated. which is impressive flexibility for a man who probably did not exist. European leaders took the idea seriously. They sent envoys. They searched for alliances. Explorers partially justified their journeys based on hopes of finding this mythical Christian ally who would help defeat Muslim powers from the other side. Imagine shaping global exploration based on a rumour. Prester John was likely inspired by fragments of real information, distant Christian communities in Asia, misunderstood reports from travellers, wishful thinking layered over geopolitical desperation. Europe wanted reinforcements, so Europe invented them. What makes the legend fascinating is not that it was false, it is that it was useful. It gave hope. It offered strategic fantasy. It reassured people that somewhere, far beyond known maps, a powerful friend was waiting. And the more uncertain the world felt, the more appealing that fantasy became. No army ever marched under Prester John's banner. No empire rose in his name. But his myth influenced diplomacy, cartography, and exploration for centuries. That is extraordinary. To possibly not exist and still impact world history. Prester John proves something important. Sometimes people do not need a real ally. They need the idea of one. And if no such king exists, well, the Middle Ages were perfectly capable of writing one into existence. Now we move from imaginary global monarchs to a man who survives decapitation, the Green Knight. If you've read medieval literature or watched any dramatic adaptations, you know him. A towering, entirely green warrior who rides into King Arthur's court during a feast and calmly proposes a game. The game is simple. One knight may strike him with an axe. In return, 1 year later, he will deliver the same blow back. Totally normal dinner entertainment. Sir Gawain accepts. He beheads the Green Knight. The Green Knight then stands up, picks up his own head, reminds Gawain of their appointment next year, and casually rides away. And for centuries people treated Arthurian legends with a semi-historical reverence. Which means that occasionally, someone somewhere has wondered whether the Green Knight might have been based on a real figure. Let's be clear, he was not. The Green Knight appears in a 14th century poem known as Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. He is not a historical character. He is a literary symbol, representing nature, temptation, moral testing, and possibly pagan survivals inside Christian storytelling. He is green for a reason. He survives decapitation for a reason. He schedules revenge for a reason. That reason is allegory. But medieval audiences did not always sharply separate literature from lived history. Arthur's court felt real. Its knights felt real. So a supernatural challenger entering that world did not automatically feel fictional. It felt legendary. And legend, in the Middle Ages, carried a weight very close to fact. The Green Knight was never meant to be historical. He was designed to test Gawain's honour, to explore themes of courage and integrity. Yet the aura of Arthurian tradition, already hovering somewhere between myth and memory, allowed him to drift into the realm of possibly real, which says something fascinating about medieval perception. If a story carried moral truth, it did not require biological plausibility. A green warrior who reattaches his head? Strange, but spiritually meaningful, and in the medieval imagination, meaningful often outranked realistic. The Green Knight never walked through an actual castle hall, but in literature, he still does, carrying his head, very confidently. Now we arrive at a legend that proves medieval writers did not believe in modest numbers. Saint Ursula. According to the story, she was a British princess who, along with 11,000 virgin companions, embarked on a grand pilgrimage across Europe. Naturally. The group travelled by sea, encountered storms, changed directions dramatically, and eventually arrived in Cologne, where they were all martyred by invading forces. 11,000. Not 11. Not even 100. 11,000. Which raises a logistical question. Where exactly were they staying? What were they eating? How did medieval shipping coordinate a fleet capable of transporting an entire small city of pilgrims? Details were not the strong point of the legend. The earliest versions of the story are vague and relatively small in scale. Over time, the number of companions grew. Because if you are telling a martyrdom story, subtlety is optional. Historians believe the number may have originated from a misreading of a Latin inscription. Something like 11 virgins may have been interpreted as 11,000 virgins, which is a substantial copy-paste error. But once the larger number appeared, it stuck. Relics multiplied. Churches were dedicated. Artworks depicted vast crowds of identical young women standing solemnly behind Ursula. Cologne embraced the story enthusiastically, because martyrdom on that scale is excellent for prestige. Was there perhaps a small group of Christian women martyred in the region? Possibly. Was there an international caravan of 11,000 royal pilgrims? Almost certainly not. But medieval devotion does not operate strictly on census data. The story served a purpose. It honoured faith. It inspired sacrifice. It elevated a city's religious importance. And once a legend becomes spiritually meaningful, arguing about headcount feels almost rude. Saint Ursula likely did not lead 11,000 companions across Europe, but in art and tradition, she still does, which tells us something important. In the Middle Ages, numerical accuracy was negotiable, symbolism was not. And if you are going to invent a pilgrimage story, you might as well make it ambitious, very ambitious. Now we leave saints and enter the realm of precision archery and questionable parenting. William Tell, the Swiss folk hero who refused to bow to a tyrannical governor's hat, because apparently medieval oppression sometimes took very symbolic forms, and was punished by being forced to shoot an apple off his son's head, which is either the ultimate act of bravery or the most unnecessary risk management decision in European folklore. According to the legend, Tell calmly prepared his crossbow, aimed, and split the apple cleanly in two. When asked why he carried a second bolt, he replied that it was meant for the governor, in case the first shot harmed his son. Very dramatic, very rebellious, very satisfying. There is just one issue. The earliest written accounts of William Tell appear in the late 15th century, centuries after the events he supposedly lived through. And even then, the story appears in ballads and chronicles, blending folklore with patriotism. Worse for Tell's credibility, nearly identical stories exist in earlier Norse and Germanic legends. In one such tale, a hero is forced to shoot an apple off his child's head by a king. The parallels are not subtle, which suggests that William Tell may not have been a historical archer, but rather a recycled heroic template. But here is where it gets interesting. The legend of William Tell became foundational to Swiss national identity. He symbolized resistance against tyranny, courage under pressure, rural independence standing firm against centralized authority. Real or not, the story did work. Statues were built, plays were written. The myth strengthened political unity. Even modern Swiss symbolism still nods toward him. Historians today generally agree there is no reliable evidence that William Tell existed as a specific individual. But in a way, that almost does not matter. Because the story accomplished what it was designed to do. It gave people a hero, a clean moral narrative, oppression versus courage, authority versus independence, and that narrative was stronger than documentation. William Tell may not have stood in a Swiss village square aiming at fruit, but in the collective imagination. He never misses, which is impressive for someone who may never have picked up a crossbow at all. Now we move from heroic archers to a man with a flute and extremely strong negotiation skills, the Pied Piper of Hamelin. According to the legend, in the 13th century, the German town of Hamelin was plagued by rats. A mysterious piper arrived, dressed in bright, unusual clothing, and offered to remove the infestation for a fee. He played his flute. The rats followed him. He led them away, sometimes into a river, depending on the version, and the town was saved. So far, this sounds like a standard medieval pest control contract. Then the town refused to pay him, which, historically speaking, is a poor decision when the person you are underpaying has magical flute powers. In revenge, the piper returned and played again, this time luring the town's children away. They followed him out of Hamelin and were never seen again. Now here is where things become complicated. Unlike some legends on this list, there is evidence that something strange did happen in Hamelin around the year 1284. Town records and later inscriptions refer to a mysterious loss of children. The details are unclear. Some historians speculate migration, others suggest disease or disaster. But the colourful piper with hypnotic music? Almost certainly a later addition. Over time, tragedy transforms into narrative. Narrative demands a character, and once a character exists, symbolism attaches itself quickly. The piper becomes a warning about broken promises, or about greed, or about the consequences of failing to honour agreements. He also becomes visually iconic, striped clothing, flute in hand, leading a silent procession. It is cinematic, and once a story becomes cinematic, it spreads. By the late Middle Ages, the Pied Piper was firmly embedded in European folklore. The original event, whatever it truly was, became secondary to the moral lesson, which is how it often works. History gives us an unexplained event. Storytelling gives us a villain with a soundtrack. The Pied Piper likely never marched through Hamelin in bright clothes commanding rodents like a freelance sorcerer. But as a symbol of broken trust, he remains very real, and he still collects payment, one way or another. Now we move from flute-playing Avengers to medieval public nudity with a political message. Lady Godiva. According to the legend, she was a noblewoman in 11th century England, married to Leofric, the Earl of Mercia. The people of Coventry were suffering under heavy taxation, and Godiva repeatedly pleaded with her husband to reduce the burden. He allegedly responded with what he thought was an impossible condition. "I will lower the taxes," he said, "if you ride naked through the town," which is a bold negotiation tactic. So, according to the story, Lady Godiva agreed. She rode through Coventry unclothed, while the townspeople respectfully stayed indoors and closed their shutters, except for one man who dared to peek. That unfortunate observer later became known as Peeping Tom, and in some versions he is struck blind. Now here is the uncomfortable truth for fans of dramatic civic protest. The earliest written version of this story appears more than a century after Godiva actually lived. Contemporary records from her lifetime mention her generosity and land donations, but nothing about an equestrian tax protest. The nude ride appears to be a later embellishment. And Peeping Tom? That detail shows up even later. In other words, the most famous part of the story is almost certainly fictional. So why did it stick? Because it is perfect medieval symbolism. A virtuous noblewoman sacrificing her modesty for the good of her people. A tyrannical husband humbled. A community united in respect. A moral lesson about greed and voyeurism, tied neatly with dramatic imagery. It is theatrical. It is memorable. It is highly paintable. And once artists began depicting it, the legend became visually permanent. Lady Godiva was real. That much is certain. The naked horseback tax rebellion? Almost certainly not. But here is the fascinating part. Her story became so embedded in English folklore that questioning it feels almost impolite. Entire festivals commemorate it. Statues celebrate it. Reality became secondary. The moral endured. Lady Godiva may not have ridden through Coventry as legend describes, but as a symbol of protest and virtue, she never dismounted. Now we move from public horse rides to national origin stories. Meet Brutus of Britain. According to medieval chroniclers, Brutus was a descendant of the Trojan hero Aeneas. After accidentally killing his father, because medieval founding myths rarely begin calmly, he was exiled and eventually sailed to a distant island inhabited by giants. That island? Britain. Brutus defeated the giants, founded a kingdom, and gave the land its name. Very efficient branding. This story appears most prominently in the 12th century work of Geoffrey of Monmouth, the same writer who upgraded King Arthur into a legendary super king. Geoffrey presented Brutus as the original founder of Britain, tracing royal genealogies back to ancient Troy. Which sounds impressive. It also sounds suspiciously like myth-building. Modern historians agree there is no archaeological or historical evidence for a Trojan prince founding Britain. The story is almost certainly a medieval invention designed to give Britain a prestigious origin story. Why Troy? Because linking your nation to the ancient world, especially to epic heroes of classical legend, was politically useful. Rome claimed Trojan ancestry. Why not Britain too? If you cannot compete militarily, compete mythologically. And medieval rulers loved a good pedigree. By tracing British kings back to Brutus and Brutus back to Troy, chroniclers created a lineage that felt grand and ancient. It legitimized rule. It elevated status. It provided narrative continuity stretching into classical antiquity. It also conveniently explained away inconvenient historical gaps. If your kingdom seems relatively young, simply add a heroic founder with mythic credentials. Problem solved. Brutus of Britain likely never set foot on the island. He probably never defeated giants. He certainly did not file paperwork claiming the territory. But for centuries, educated readers treated him as real. Maps referenced him. Chronicles listed him. Monarchs were linked to him. A fictional ancestor became a cornerstone of national identity. And that tells us something important about medieval history writing. It was not just about recording events, it was about constructing legitimacy. Brutus did not conquer Britain, but in the imagination of medieval chroniclers, he built the foundation. And foundations, even imaginary ones, can hold a very long time. Now we shift from invented founders to eternal punishment, the wandering Jew. According to medieval legend, this was a man who mocked or insulted Jesus on the way to the crucifixion and was cursed to wander the earth until the second coming. No death, no rest, just centuries of walking. Very long-term consequences for one bad interaction. The story begins appearing in Europe in the 13th century. A mysterious man allegedly shows up in various cities, claiming to be the cursed wanderer. Chronicles record sightings. Sermons mention him. People swear they met him. Conveniently, he always seems to appear during times of crisis. Plagues, wars, social unrest. Strange how that works. Historically, there is no evidence that such a person existed. The legend appears to have evolved from earlier Christian storytelling traditions, blending moral warning with apocalyptic imagination. But once the story circulated, it took on a life of its own. The wandering Jew became a symbol of unbelief, of exile, of divine judgment, and unfortunately, over time, the legend also became entangled with anti-Jewish stereotypes and persecution. What began as allegorical storytelling hardened into something darker. That is often how myths behave. They start as cautionary tales. They end up influencing real attitudes toward real people. The wandering Jew was never a historical individual roaming Europe for centuries, but the belief that he might exist shaped sermons, literature, and public imagination. He became a living reminder of divine justice, or divine threat, depending on perspective. And here is the unsettling part. People claimed to see him. Over and over. Different names, different cities, always old, always tired, always cursed. When a story fits cultural fears, witnesses tend to appear. The wandering Jew never truly walked medieval streets, but he walked through medieval anxiety. He embodied guilt, judgment, and the idea that history itself carries consequences. And like many legends on this list, his power came not from physical existence, but from psychological resonance. He may not have been real, but the fear he represented certainly was. Now we move from eternal wanderers to heroic overachievement. Roland. If you have ever encountered medieval epic poetry, You have likely met him. A fearless knight serving Charlemagne, standing against overwhelming enemy forces at the Battle of Roncevaux Pass. According to the Song of Roland, written in the 11th century, Roland commanded the rear guard of Charlemagne's army when it was ambushed by vast Muslim forces. Outnumbered and betrayed, he fought heroically. He refused to blow his horn to call for help, because pride, and battled until nearly everyone around him was dead. Finally, when he did blow the horn, he did so with such force that his temples burst. Yes, he effectively shouted himself to death. It is dramatic. It is epic. It is emotionally intense. It is also exaggerated. There was indeed a historical battle at Roncevaux Pass in the year 778. Charlemagne's rearguard was attacked, but the attackers were not a massive Muslim army. They were Basque fighters, and the skirmish, while unfortunate, was not the cataclysmic clash described in the poem. Roland himself may have existed as a Frankish military officer, but the larger-than-life hero who single-handedly embodied Christian chivalry? That is poetic transformation at full power. Medieval poets did not simply record events. They upgraded them. A small ambush became a holy war. A fallen officer became the model of knightly virtue. A tactical loss became a glorious martyrdom. Why? Because stories need scale. Roland's refusal to call for help becomes a lesson about pride. His final horn blast becomes a symbol of tragic heroism. His death becomes sanctified. The historical truth may have been far less cinematic, but the cinematic version endured. For centuries, the Song of Roland shaped ideas about loyalty, faith, courage, and sacrifice. It became foundational to medieval identity. And once that happens, separating fact from poetry becomes almost irrelevant. Roland probably did not explode his own skull with a horn, but in literature, he still stands at the pass, defiant, outnumbered, and impossibly heroic, which proves something simple. History gives us events, epic poetry gives us legends, and legends are very difficult to downgrade. Now we step into something even more ambitious than a single fictional hero, an entire fictional group, the Nine Worthies. If you were a medieval noble trying to understand what ideal greatness looked like, you did not scroll through social media. You looked to the Nine Worthies, a curated collection of 9 legendary figures who supposedly represented the highest form of chivalric virtue. The lineup included 3 pagans: Hector of Troy, Alexander the Great, and Julius Caesar; 3 Jews, Joshua, King David, and Judas Maccabeus; and 3 Christians, King Arthur, Charlemagne, and Godfrey of Bouillon. An impressive roster. There is just one small issue. As a historical group, they never existed. These men lived centuries apart, in entirely different civilizations, and in some cases, like King Arthur, may not have existed in the legendary form presented. The Nine Worthies were a medieval construction, a symbolic dream team assembled in the 14th century to represent universal ideals of courage, leadership, and moral strength. Basically, medieval fantasy football. Writers and artists loved them. They appeared in tapestries, manuscripts, sculptures, and court pageants. Noblemen were compared to them. Sometimes even local rulers were added to the list as a 10th worthy because humility was optional. The concept was powerful because it created continuity. By grouping classical heroes, biblical leaders, and medieval kings into one tidy set, chroniclers suggested that chivalric greatness transcended time and religion. It felt cohesive. It felt authoritative. It also blurred history and myth together in a very comfortable way. No one paused to say, wait, are we sure Arthur belongs in the same category as Caesar? Because the point was not factual accuracy. The point was inspiration. The Nine Worthies functioned as moral templates. They were less about what actually happened, and more about what should happen, how a knight should behave, how a ruler should act. They were ideals, and ideals rarely worry about documentation. The Nine Worthies never sat around a table together. They never met. They were never an official council of legendary excellence, but in medieval imagination, they stood shoulder to shoulder, timeless. unified, and entirely curated, which may be the most medieval thing of all. Now we arrive at one of the most famous dragon slayings in Western history, St. George. If you have ever seen a medieval painting of a knight on horseback skewering a dragon, chances are it was him. Calm expression, lance extended, dragon dramatically writhing beneath hooves, princess waiting nearby looking grateful and mildly concerned. It is iconic. It is heroic. It is extremely reptile-specific. Here is the part that complicates things. There probably was a real St. George, a Christian martyr from the 3rd or 4th century. Early sources suggest he was executed during Roman persecution. That part is historically plausible. The dragon, not mentioned. The dragon-slaying episode appears centuries later in medieval hagiographies, especially in the 13th century Golden Legend, a wildly popular collection of saint stories that was not overly concerned with strict documentation. In the dragon version, George saves a town terrorized by a monstrous beast. The townspeople have been sacrificing livestock, and eventually people, to appease it. When the king's daughter is chosen as the next victim, George arrives, defeats the dragon, and converts the town to Christianity. It is tidy. It is symbolic. It is theologically convenient. The dragon represents evil, paganism, chaos, or the devil, depending on interpretation. George represents faith and righteousness. The story is less about zoology and more about spiritual triumph. But medieval audiences did not always separate metaphor from biography. Once the dragon episode was written down and copied widely, it became part of George's identity. Paintings reinforced it, churches celebrated it, banners displayed it. Eventually, St. George became the patron saint of England. Yes. England's national patron saint is famous primarily for defeating a creature that does not exist, which is both slightly ironic and deeply medieval. Did George ever face an actual dragon? Almost certainly not, but as a symbol of moral victory, unbeatable, and that is the pattern we keep seeing. A small historical figure becomes layered with legend. The legend becomes more famous than the person, and soon, questioning the dragon feels almost disrespectful. St. George may not have fought fire-breathing reptiles, but in medieval imagination, he slays them daily, and looks very good doing it. Now we end where many medieval myths quietly begin. Family trees. Specifically, extremely ambitious family trees. If you were a medieval ruler and wanted to prove your legitimacy, you had two options: win wars, or trace your ancestry back to someone impressive. Guess which one required less physical risk? Medieval chroniclers became remarkably creative when constructing royal genealogies. Entire dynasties were linked to biblical figures, Trojan heroes, ancient emperors, or conveniently legendary founders who may or may not have existed. If your kingdom was relatively young, no problem. Simply add several generations of noble ancestors stretching back to antiquity, preferably to Troy. Troy was very popular. Brutus of Britain was not the only invented founder. Many European royal houses claimed descent from classical heroes. Some traced their lineage back to Noah's sons. Others linked themselves to figures from scripture or epic poetry. Was there evidence? Evidence was flexible. The point was not verification. The point was legitimacy. If you could claim that your bloodline stretched back to heroic antiquity, your authority felt older, more sacred, more inevitable. And once that genealogy was written into a respected chronicle, copied by scribes, and read aloud in courts, it gained weight. Repetition creates credibility. Entire phantom kings were inserted into these family trees. Rulers who reigned for decades, fought battles, founded cities, and conveniently bridged historical gaps. No archaeological trace, no contemporary record, just ink on parchment. But those phantom ancestors served a purpose. They provided continuity. They eliminated awkward blank spaces in national history. They transformed emerging kingdoms into ancient civilizations overnight. And once a ruler publicly claimed such ancestry, challenging it was politically dangerous. so the fiction endured. What makes this fascinating is that these invented figures shaped real politics. Marriages were arranged based on supposed lineage, alliances justified by shared mythical bloodlines, wars framed as the restoration of ancient rights, all rooted in people who never existed. In a way, these phantom kings may be the most powerful figures on this list. They did not slay dragons, they did not ride naked through towns, they did not shoot apples off children's heads. They simply sat quietly in genealogies and held entire monarchies together, which proves something remarkable about the Middle Ages. Sometimes the most influential people in history were never alive at all. Before you taste the honey cakes, before you sip the beer, before you even argue over the price of lamb, you smell the bread. In ancient Babylon, bread was not an accessory to the meal. It was the meal. It was the plate, the spoon, the napkin, and occasionally the peace offering. Grain grown in the rich soil between the rivers was hauled into the city, ground by hand on heavy stone querns, and turned into flour by people whose shoulders were permanently sore. Convenience had not yet been invented. The dough was simple: crushed grain, water, sometimes a little salt. If you were lucky, a bit of sour starter saved from yesterday's batch. No fancy ingredients, no dramatic branding, just survival, needed daily. Then came the oven, the clay oven, round and squat, burned hot and furious. Bakers fed it reeds and wood until the interior walls radiated heat like the surface of the sun. A skilled baker would slap the flattened dough directly onto the inner wall. It stuck. It blistered. It baked in moments. If you hesitated, you burned your hand. If you misjudged the heat, you burned the bread. There were no timers, only instinct and scars. Markets gathered in the shadow of towering ziggurats, stepped temples that reminded everyone that the gods were watching. And beneath those sacred silhouettes, very human things happened. Children ran between stalls, merchants shouted, donkeys complained loudly about their career choices. And somewhere in the middle of it all, bread came out of the oven in steady rhythm. The smell drifted through the air, warm, nutty, slightly smoky. Customers would tear pieces off while it was still steaming, dipping it into oil, wrapping it around herbs, or using it to scoop up lentils and stewed vegetables. Bread was currency in its own way. Workers were paid in it. Families measured security in baskets of it. A bad harvest meant thin loaves and thinner patience. There was nothing glamorous about it. No decorative scoring, no artisanal storytelling. Just heat, grain, and hunger meeting in perfect agreement. Under the shadow of the ziggurat, bread rose and blistered, humble and essential. And from that simple foundation, the rest of Babylonian street food began. If bread was survival, dates were pleasure. Just beyond the bread ovens of Babylon, baskets of glossy brown dates sat piled high like edible treasure. They came from the endless groves that lined the Euphrates, where date palms thrived in the heat that made lesser plants surrender. To Babylonians, the date palm was not just a tree, it was a provider. Fruit, syrup, fibre, even wood. A botanical overachiever. Street vendors turned those sticky fruits into something dangerously addictive: date cakes. The process was simple but effective. Dates were pitted and crushed into a thick paste, their natural sugars doing most of the heavy lifting. The paste was mixed with ground barley or wheat flour, shaped into small rounds, and baked on hot stones or inside clay ovens. Sometimes sesame seeds were pressed into the surface. Sometimes chopped nuts found their way in. And if the gods were smiling on your wallet that day, the cakes were dipped in honey. Honey was luxury. Not outrageously rare, but precious enough to make people pause before drizzling it. Bees were respected collaborators in the Babylonian food chain. Their work turned simple date cakes into something that felt suspiciously close to dessert. Picture the market scene. Under the looming steps of a ziggurat, vendors calling out their offerings, flies buzzing optimistically, and somewhere in the middle of it all, a tray of golden brown cakes glistening in the sun. Children stared at them. Labourers debated whether the sweetness justified the price. Priests, pretending indifference, bought them anyway. The first bite was dense and chewy. Sweet, but not refined sugar-sweet. Earthy. Caramel-like. A slow sweetness that clung to your fingers. You did not eat a date cake delicately. You committed to it. These cakes were portable energy. Perfect for farmers heading back to the fields, merchants preparing for long negotiations, or travellers about to leave the city gates. In a world without energy, bars wrapped in shiny packaging, this was the original performance snack, and while bread kept Babylon alive, date cakes made life worth chewing on. If bread was survival and dates were pleasure, lamb was power. In the markets of Babylon, meat was not an everyday guarantee for everyone. It required animals, pasture, labour, and most importantly, money. But when lamb did appear on the street, it did not arrive quietly. It announced itself in smoke. Near the edge of the market, away from the delicate sweetness of date cakes, you would find low clay braziers glowing with coals. Skewers of lamb were threaded carefully through with chunks of fat left intact. Because even ancient cooks understood that flavour lives in the fat. The meat hissed the moment it touched heat. Drippings fell, flames flared, and the air changed. Then came the cumin. Cumin was one of the defining flavours of Mesopotamian cooking. Warm, earthy, slightly bitter. Ground into powder and rubbed generously over the meat, sometimes mixed with crushed garlic or wild herbs, it clung to the surface and darkened as the lamb roasted. The scent drifted outward, weaving through the crowd like a persuasive argument. You could follow that smell blindfolded. Customers gathered close, pretending they were only passing by. Labourers with dust still clinging to their clothes, merchants counting copper pieces in their hands, travellers fresh from the roads beyond the Euphrates, hungry enough to consider selling a sandal. The vendor turned the skewers slowly, carefully. Too fast and the outside burned before the inside cooked. Too slow and the juices vanished. There was no thermometer, only experience, and the quiet confidence of someone who had ruined enough meat in the past to avoid doing it again. When ready, the lamb was pulled from the fire and served simply, sometimes wrapped in fresh flatbread, sometimes laid over a bed of herbs. No elaborate plating, no decorative garnish, just charred edges, tender centre, and cumin rising in warm waves. The first bite was immediate satisfaction. Smoky, slightly crisp outside, soft within. The cumin hit first, then the richness of the meat. You felt it in your stomach before you even finished chewing. In a city defined by temples and trade, lamb skewers were a reminder that sometimes the most powerful thing in Babylon was not a king or a god. It was fire, meat, and spice. If lamb was power, beer was democracy. In Babylon, beer was not a weekend indulgence. It was daily hydration, social glue, and occasionally safer than water drawn straight from the Euphrates. Children drank diluted versions. Labourers drank it thick and hearty. Even temple workers were not strangers to a cup or two. Civilization ran on barley and optimism. Babylonian beer was not the clear, golden liquid you imagine sliding elegantly into a glass. It was cloudy, dense, sometimes almost porridge-like, brewed from barley loaves that were partially baked, crumbled, soaked, and left to ferment. It carried bits of grain and sediment in every sip. You did not swirl it. You navigated it. Vendors sold beer from large clay jars positioned carefully in the shade of market stalls. The jars were wide-bellied, their surfaces cool to the touch despite the heat. The beer inside fermented naturally, quietly bubbling with microscopic determination. When a customer approached, the vendor dipped a clay cup into the jar or poured carefully from a spouted vessel. No polished metal, no decorative handle, just earth holding earth. Some wealthier drinkers used long straws to avoid the floating grain debris. Practical, slightly elegant. Also a quiet admission that chewing your drink was not always desirable. The taste was sour-sweet, mildly bitter with a grainy backbone. It refreshed, but it also filled. After a long morning hauling stone, shaping bricks, or arguing over prices in the market, beer was both reward and refueling station. And it was social. Men gathered near the stalls, discussing trade, gossiping about officials, debating crop yields, or complaining about taxes. Laughter rose easily. Disputes were settled. New ones were born. Beer softened edges, but did not erase ambition. Even under the shadow of towering ziggurats, where priests conducted rituals and kings proclaimed decrees, everyday life pulsed around clay cups filled with fermented barley. Gods might have shaped destiny, but barley shaped afternoons. In a world of scorching sun and hard labour, beer was steady comfort. Not glamorous, not refined, but reliable. In Babylon, if bread built the body and lamb fed pride, beer carried the conversation forward, one cloudy, satisfying sip at a time. If beer fueled the conversation, fish fed the river's gift back to the city. The Euphrates was not just scenery for Babylon. It was lifeline, highway, irrigation system, and pantry. At dawn, fishermen pushed narrow boats into the current, casting woven nets into the slow-moving water. By midday, the market would smell faintly of scales and smoke. Fish arrived glistening, silver and bronze under the sun. Some were small and plentiful. Others were thick-bodied and heavy, requiring both hands and a confident grip. Vendors cleaned them quickly on low wooden tables, scraping scales with practiced flicks of a blade. The sound was sharp and rhythmic. Scrape, turn. Scrape again. Unlike lamb, fish did not demand luxury spices. It demanded speed. Near the edge of the market, braziers burned low and steady. Whole fish were skewered or laid across simple grates over open flame, sometimes stuffed with herbs, sometimes rubbed with salt and crushed coriander, occasionally brushed with date syrup for a faint caramelized glaze that clung to the skin as it blistered. The skin tightened first. Then it crackled. The smell was clean and smoky, drifting through the air in lighter waves than the heavy cumin of lamb. People gathered, drawn not by spectacle, but by familiarity. Fish was more accessible than meat, less status, more sustenance. The vendor watched closely. Too much heat and the flesh dried into disappointment. Too little and it remained soft, almost hesitant. Timing mattered. A skilled hand knew exactly when to flip, when to pull, when to serve. Served hot, the skin crisped under your fingers. Beneath it, the flesh flaked apart in tender layers. Mild, slightly sweet, carrying the subtle taste of river and smoke. Eaten with flatbread, perhaps dipped into a sauce of herbs or garlic, it felt honest. Fishermen stood nearby, scanning faces, silently measuring demand. Children lingered for scraps. Cats, opportunists long before civilization perfected the concept, hovered at the edges. Under the vast Mesopotamian sky, fish connected city and river in a single bite. No grand ceremony, no priestly blessing, just flame, water, and hunger in quiet agreement. In Babylon's street markets, the river was always present, not just flowing past the city walls, but sizzling gently over coals. If fish carried the river to the market, lentils carried the field. In Babylon, not everyone could afford lamb skewers or honey-drenched cakes, but nearly everyone could afford lentils. They were humble, durable, and unbothered by dramatic weather. They stored well, cooked reliably, and did not complain. In other words, they were the backbone of civilization. Near the centre of the market, away from the flashier stalls, large clay pots sat over slow, steady fires. Inside, lentils simmered in thick, bubbling stews. The surface shifted lazily, releasing gentle bursts of steam scented with onion, garlic, and whatever herbs the cook had managed to secure that day. No spectacle, no dramatic flames, just patience. The cook stirred with a wooden ladle worn smooth from years of repetition. Sometimes barley was added to thicken the mixture. Sometimes chopped leeks or wild greens found their way in. A pinch of salt if available. A scatter of coriander or cumin if the vendor was feeling generous or competitive. The result was thick, earthy, filling. Customers approached without ceremony. Labourers with dust still on their sandals. Women balancing baskets of grain. Scribes with ink-stained fingers. A small clay bowl was filled, steam rising into the warm air. A piece of flatbread accompanied it, not for decoration, but for utility. You did not sip lentil stew. You scooped it. Bread became spoon. Fingers became tools. The first mouthful was simple comfort. Soft lentils breaking apart, mild sweetness from cooked onions, a whisper of spice in the background. It was not exciting food. It was dependable food, the kind that settled into your stomach and allowed you to return to work without complaint. Around the stall, conversations were quieter than at the beer jars. This was not indulgence. This was refueling. In the shadow of towering temples and ambitious kings, lentil stew represented something more stable than glory, continuity. Empires rose and fell. Floodwaters came and receded. Markets expanded and shifted. But somewhere in Babylon, a clay pot always simmered with lentils. And for most of the city, that was more than enough. After lentils and bread and meat, after sweetness and smoke, the palate needed interruption. Enter the pickles. In the bustling markets of Babylon, not everything was meant to be eaten fresh. The Mesopotamian sun was relentless, and food that did not adapt simply disappeared. So vendors learned to preserve. They salted, they brined, they submerged vegetables in jars and waited for time to do the heavy lifting. Clay jars lined certain stalls like squat guardians of sharp flavour. Inside, cucumbers, onions, turnips, and even garlic cloves floated in salty, tangy solutions. The brine was cloudy, fragrant with herbs and sometimes spiked with crushed mustard seeds or wild spices. Lids were sealed with cloth or wax, then reopened with a quiet pop that promised intensity. Pickles were not meant to be centre stage. They were supporting actors with dramatic personalities. A labourer finishing a bowl of lentils might buy a handful of pickled onions to slice through the heaviness. A merchant chewing on lamb might reach for something sour to balance the fat. Even fish, mild and flaky, welcomed a sharp companion on the side. The first bite was immediate and unapologetic. Salty, sour, crisp. Your jaw tightened slightly. Your eyes widened just a fraction. That was the point. Pickled foods woke you up. They demanded attention, and they lasted. In a city where harvests could fail and supply lines could falter, preserved foods were security. They sat patiently on shelves, immune to heat and delay. A jar opened weeks after sealing still delivered flavour with confidence. No rush, no panic. Children sometimes dared each other to eat the sourest piece. Adults pretended not to enjoy the theatrical sharpness, then reached for another anyway. It was food with attitude. Under the looming steps of the ziggurats, amid smoke and sweet syrup and bubbling stew, these jars of brine offered contrast. They reminded Babylon that balance mattered. Sweet needed sour. Fat needed sharp. Abundance needed preservation. Civilization, like flavour, depended on tension. And sometimes the smallest bite carried the loudest voice. Not everything in Babylon sizzled dramatically over open flame or simmered for hours in clay pots. Some foods required less spectacle and more subtlety. Nuts and seeds were the quiet merchants of the street. Baskets of pistachios, almonds, sesame seeds, and roasted chickpeas sat in neat mounds beneath linen cloths to keep out dust. They did not shout like the lamb vendors. They did not perfume the air like honeyed cakes. But they were steady sellers, portable, affordable, and endlessly practical. Roasting happened in shallow metal or clay pans set over low coals. A vendor would stir constantly, listening for the faint crackle that signalled readiness. Sesame seeds popped lightly. Chickpeas darkened and hardened. Almond skins tightened and split. The scent was subtle but irresistible. Warm, toasty, slightly sweet. It drifted just enough to catch attention without overwhelming it. Customers often bought nuts in small handfuls, poured directly into cloth pouches or cupped palms. They were eaten while walking, while bargaining, while watching a public dispute unfold near the market's edge. You could snack without committing to a full meal. Civilization's first convenience food. Sesame seeds held special importance. Crushed into paste or sprinkled over bread, they added richness and texture. A thin sesame spread brushed over warm flatbread created a nutty gloss that clung to the tongue. Simple ingredients, carefully handled. Roasted chickpeas were different, firm, almost crunchy. They demanded effort from your teeth but rewarded persistence. Protein without extravagance, strength without showmanship. Nuts also travelled well. Merchants heading beyond the city gates along the routes that followed the Euphrates packed them for long journeys. Light, durable, resistant to spoilage, a snack that respected distance. Children hovered near these stalls, hoping for a stray almond. Elders chewed slowly, savouring the rhythm of it. Roasted seeds cracked between molars like small punctuation marks in the day. In a market filled with smoke, syrup, and simmering stew, nuts and seeds offered texture, literal and cultural. They were proof that street food did not need grandeur to endure. Sometimes all you needed was heat, patience, and a handful of something roasted to perfection. By late afternoon, the market of Babylon changed its rhythm. The harsh edge of noon softened. Smoke from braziers thinned into blue threads. Clay ovens cooled. The great ziggurat cast a longer shadow, stretching across stalls of bread, fish, lentils, nuts, and honeyed cakes like a silent supervisor reviewing the day's work. Street food in Babylon was never just about eating. It was choreography. Vendors called out final offers. Fresh bread. Last skewers. Sweet dates. Voices overlapped in a practiced symphony of urgency. Buyers weighed copper pieces in their hands, calculating dinner. Children tugged at sleeves, lobbying for one more sweet cake before sunset. Near the beer jars, conversations grew slower, heavier. Clay cups clinked gently. A final dip of the ladle. The sediment at the bottom was thicker now, proof that the day had been generous. The fish sellers packed away their remaining catch, salting what had not sold. The lentil pot, scraped low, revealed its clay bottom in widening circles. A vendor brushed sesame seeds back into a basket with careful hands. Nothing wasted. And above it all, the stepped silhouette of the temple loomed, a reminder that the gods had their own appetites. Offerings had been made earlier in the day. Bread, beer, perhaps even lamb. Divine and human consumption mirrored each other. One for survival, one for favour. As the sun dropped closer to the horizon, families gathered what they had purchased. Flatbread tucked under arms, bundles of herbs tied with twine, a small jar of pickled onions swinging lightly from a cord. Smoke clung to clothing. Honey stuck faintly to fingers. The market thinned, but it never truly slept. Babylon did not freeze when the sun went down. Night brought cooler air and softer conversations. Some vendors remained, catering to labourers finishing late shifts or travellers arriving after a long journey along the Euphrates. Under the vast Mesopotamian sky, with the scent of cumin and barley still lingering, the city digested itself, literally and figuratively. Bread had blistered, lamb had charred, beer had clouded clay cups. Lentils had simmered patiently, and beneath the watchful shadow of stone and sky, Babylon had eaten well. In the year 1046, in the turbulent lands of northern Italy, a girl was born into a dynasty that did not believe in softness. Her name was Matilda of Tuscany. She was the daughter of Boniface III of Tuscany, one of the most powerful lords in Italy, and Beatrice of Lorraine, a woman whose political instincts were as sharp as any blade in her husband's armoury. Their lands stretched across key territories between Lombardy and central Italy, controlling strategic passes, fertile plains, and roads that emperors and popes both desperately needed. Matilda did not grow up in a peaceful castle filled with harp music and idle luxury. She grew up in a fortress of ambition. Her childhood was marked early by violence. When she was still young, her father was assassinated. Just like that, the security of her world cracked open. Power in medieval Europe was never inherited peacefully. It was tested, challenged, and often soaked in blood. Her mother, Beatrice, refused to crumble. Instead, she manoeuvred. She remarried Godfrey the Bearded, strengthening alliances beyond Italy. But this move angered the German king, Henry III, who saw such independent alliances as threats. Beatrice was imprisoned. Matilda, still a child, was swept into the storm of imperial politics before she was old enough to fully understand it. Most medieval girls were trained for marriage. Matilda was trained for survival. She received an education rare for women of her time. She learned Latin, theology, governance, and the mechanics of land management. She listened to bishops debate doctrine. She watched knights negotiate loyalty. She absorbed everything. This was not accidental. Her mother understood something crucial. Their territories were too important to leave to weak hands. By the time Matilda entered adolescence, she had already witnessed assassination, imprisonment, political tension with the empire, and the fragile dance between crown and church. Childhood, for her, was short. The world she inherited was divided between two towering forces, the Holy Roman Emperor and the papacy. And soon, this young noblewoman would stand between them. Not as a bystander, but as a decisive force in one of the greatest power struggles of medieval Europe. If Matilda's childhood taught her anything, it was this. Power in medieval Europe did not rest quietly. It clashed. By the time Matilda of Tuscany reached adulthood, the political atmosphere was electric. The struggle between the Holy Roman Emperor and the papacy was no longer a distant tension. It was an open confrontation. At the centre of the storm stood Pope Gregory VII and Henry IV. The issue? Investiture, the right to appoint bishops. On the surface, it sounded technical, but in reality, it was explosive. Bishops controlled vast lands and wealth. Whoever appointed them controlled influence. For generations, emperors had claimed that right. Gregory VII disagreed. He declared that only the church could appoint its own leaders. No king, no emperor, no secular ruler had the authority to place a ring on a bishop's finger. Henry IV did not take kindly to being told what he could not do. The conflict escalated quickly. Letters turned hostile. Accusations of corruption flew across Europe. Eventually, Gregory excommunicated Henry. That single act was devastating. An excommunicated ruler was cut off spiritually. His subjects were no longer bound to obey him. His legitimacy crumbled overnight. And this is where Matilda stepped forward. Her territories in northern Italy were strategically positioned between Germany and Rome. Armies moving south toward the papacy had to pass through her lands. Castles, fortresses, mountain passes, she controlled them. Matilda sided firmly with the Pope. This was not a symbolic gesture. It was a calculated political alignment. By backing Gregory, she placed herself directly against Henry IV, one of the most powerful men in Europe. Many nobles hesitated during this crisis. They weighed risk and reward carefully. Matilda did not hesitate. She offered military support, refuge, and loyalty to the papal cause. Her castles became safe havens. Her soldiers became part of the church's defensive strength. Europe watched closely. A woman commanding troops and openly defying the emperor was not common. It was extraordinary. The struggle between crown and mitre was no longer abstract theology. It had become territorial, personal, and militarized. And at its centre stood Matilda, not as a passive noblewoman, but as a strategic pillar in the fight that would reshape Christendom. The conflict between Pope and Emperor reached its dramatic peak in the winter of 1077, and the stage was set at Canossa, one of Matilda of Tuscany's most formidable castles. Snow covered the Apennine hills. The wind cut through armour and bone alike. Inside the fortress walls stood Pope Gregory VII under Matilda's protection. Outside, approaching in desperation, was Henry IV, excommunicated, politically isolated, and facing rebellion at home. Excommunication had shaken his rule. German princes were already restless. If he did not reconcile with the Church, he risked losing his throne entirely. So he made a decision that stunned Europe. He came to Canossa to seek forgiveness. The image has echoed through centuries. The Holy Roman Emperor standing barefoot in the snow, dressed in penitential robes, waiting outside the castle gates for 3 days. Whether every detail unfolded exactly as later chroniclers described is debated. But the symbolism was undeniable. An emperor humbling himself before the Pope. And behind those walls stood Matilda. She was not merely an observer, she acted as mediator. Gregory trusted her. Henry needed her cooperation to even reach the Pope. Without her, there was no safe audience, no negotiation. Inside the castle, discussions were tense. Gregory feared appearing weak. Henry feared returning home without absolution. Matilda balanced both worlds. Loyalty to the papacy, but also an understanding of political reality. Finally, Gregory lifted the excommunication. Henry was restored to communion. Publicly, it looked like a victory for the Church. The emperor had submitted, the Pope had prevailed, and Matilda's fortress had become the symbol of that triumph. But the reconciliation did not end the conflict. The humiliation at Canossa burned deeply in Henry. Power struggles do not disappear because of one dramatic gesture in the snow. They simmer. Still, Canossa changed everything. It demonstrated that spiritual authority could challenge imperial might. It proved that Matilda's lands were not peripheral territories. They were central to European politics, and it cemented her reputation. Not simply as a landholder, but as a decisive force in the greatest political drama of her age. If Canossa looked like the Church's victory, it did not end the war. Humiliation has consequences. After his dramatic penance at Canossa, Henry IV returned north, determined not to remain the emperor who knelt in the snow. Political reconciliation had bought him time, not submission. Civil war erupted within the empire. German princes revolted. Rival claimants to the throne appeared. Meanwhile, Pope Gregory VII continued to challenge imperial authority. The fragile peace shattered, and once again, Matilda of Tuscany chose her side. She did not retreat into safety. She mobilized. Matilda commanded troops across her vast territories in northern and central Italy. Fortresses were reinforced, supply lines secured, mountain passes guarded. Her lands became the defensive shield of the papal cause. Henry marched south more than once, determined to break resistance and assert control over Rome itself. When imperial forces entered Italy, Matilda met them not with speeches, but with soldiers. She led armies personally. Chroniclers describe her riding on horseback, armoured, visible to her troops. This was no symbolic leadership. She understood logistics, terrain, and siege warfare. Castles under her command resisted imperial assaults. Skirmishes and campaigns stretched over years. In one significant clash near Sorbara, Matilda's forces defeated imperial troops despite being outnumbered. It was a powerful message. The emperor could not simply sweep through her territories. Henry retaliated by supporting an anti-pope, a rival claimant installed in opposition to Gregory. Rome itself became a battleground of legitimacy. Imperial troops entered the city. Gregory was forced into exile. The conflict was no longer theoretical theology. It was burning villages, contested cities, shifting alliances, and through it all, Matilda remained steadfast. Her loyalty to the reform papacy did not waver, even when the tide turned against Gregory personally. When Gregory died in exile, the reform movement continued, and Matilda continued with it. For nearly 4 decades, she stood in opposition to imperial domination. It was costly, it was dangerous, it was relentless. But she never surrendered her position. In an age when most women were married off to secure alliances, Matilda commanded fortresses, faced emperors, and reshaped the political map of Italy. The war did not make her a legend. Her endurance did. For a woman of her rank, marriage was never supposed to be optional. It was political currency. And yet, for Matilda of Tuscany, marriage became something far more complicated than alliance. Her first marriage, arranged while she was still young, was to Godfrey the Hunchback, son of her stepfather. On paper, it strengthened ties between Italian and Lotharingian power. In reality, it was tense from the beginning. Godfrey supported imperial authority. Matilda stood firmly with the reform papacy. Politics invaded their marriage almost immediately. They lived largely apart. Trust eroded. Their only child died in infancy, a devastating blow both personally and dynastically. When Godfrey was assassinated, Matilda did not remarry immediately, despite pressure. For a medieval noblewoman without a surviving heir, that was extraordinary. Many expected her territories to be absorbed by a stronger male figure. But Matilda governed alone. Years later, in another strategic calculation, she married Welf V, a much younger Bavarian noble aligned with anti-imperial forces. It was a bold political move meant to strengthen opposition to Henry IV. The marriage was controversial. The age difference raised eyebrows. The political motives were obvious. And once again, it did not last. They separated without producing an heir. By medieval standards, this was almost unthinkable. 2 high-profile marriages, no surviving children. And yet, Matilda's power did not dissolve, because her authority did not come from her husbands. It came from her control of land, fortresses, and loyalty networks carefully built over decades. She managed estates personally. She issued charters. She oversaw legal matters. She commanded troops when necessary. In a world where female rule was often viewed as temporary or conditional, Matilda created something different: sustained independent governance. She did not rule as someone's wife. She ruled as Matilda. And that distinction mattered. Her marriages were strategic tools, not defining cages. When alliances failed or outlived their usefulness, she remained. While emperors struggled with rebellions and popes battled legitimacy crises, Matilda maintained her grip on Tuscany and beyond. In doing so, she quietly redefined what medieval female authority could look like, not ornamental, not accidental, but deliberate, enduring and unmistakably sovereign. If marriage never defined Matilda, war certainly did. By the early 12th century, the struggle between empire and papacy had not disappeared. It had simply evolved. Henry IV was aging, weakened by rebellion and internal conflict. Eventually, even his own son turned against him. But the imperial challenge did not die with one ruler. His successor, Henry V, inherited not only the crown, but the unresolved tension between throne and altar. And once again, Matilda of Tuscany found herself at the centre of it. Rome became the focal point. Imperial armies advanced south with renewed confidence, determined to secure coronation and assert control over papal elections. The city that symbolised spiritual authority became a chessboard of competing loyalties. Matilda, though no longer young, remained active. Her territories were still the strategic bridge between German imperial forces and Rome. Every march south required negotiation or confrontation with her. In one campaign, Henry V moved aggressively into Italy, forcing a tense standoff. Unlike his father's dramatic humiliation at Canossa, Henry V preferred calculated pressure. He detained the Pope, negotiated from strength, and attempted to force concessions. Matilda responded not recklessly, but carefully. She reinforced strongholds, protected communication routes, and maintained alliances with reform-minded clergy. She understood that outright confrontation could devastate her lands, but passive submission would erase decades of resistance. This phase of the conflict was less theatrical than Canossa, but more intricate. Diplomacy intertwined with military manoeuvring. Temporary agreements were signed and broken. Promises were made under duress. Rome itself saw violence. Crowds rioted. Factions clashed. Papal authority wavered under imperial presence. And through it all, Matilda's position remained crucial. She was not simply a supporter of reform, she was its territorial backbone. Without her lands, the papacy's independence in Italy would have been far more fragile. Even in later years, when physical campaigning grew harder, her political influence endured. Bishops, abbots, and nobles sought her support. Her name still carried weight. Rome burned with tension, but Tuscany held firm. Matilda had spent a lifetime navigating between sword and crozier, empire and church. Now, as a new emperor tested her resolve, she proved that age had not softened her. It had refined her. By the time Matilda of Tuscany entered the final years of her life, she had already done what few medieval rulers ever achieved. She had survived. She had outlasted Henry IV. She had negotiated with Henry V. She had seen popes rise, fall, and rise again. But survival was not enough for Matilda. She wanted permanence, and so she made one of the most controversial decisions of her life. Matilda formally donated the bulk of her vast territories to the papacy. This act, often referred to as the donation of Matilda, was not a spontaneous gesture of piety. It was calculated. Her lands stretched across much of northern and central Italy, key routes, fortified cities, agricultural wealth. By transferring them to the church, she aimed to secure papal independence from imperial encroachment. It was a strategic masterstroke. But it was also explosive. The Holy Roman Emperor did not accept the donation as legitimate. From the imperial perspective, Matilda held many of her lands as fiefs granted under imperial authority. They were not hers to give away freely. In imperial eyes, the donation threatened to carve out a semi-independent papal state in the heart of Italy. And that is exactly what it did. The legal status of her lands would be disputed for decades after her death. Negotiations, treaties, and compromises would follow. The tension between empire and papacy, already fierce, gained new fuel. But Matilda's intention was clear. She believed in the reform papacy. She believed that the church should not be subordinate to imperial will. By binding her territories to Rome, she strengthened the territorial foundation that would eventually evolve into the papal states. Few medieval women, few medieval rulers, period, reshaped political geography so directly. The decision was bold, almost defiant. She had no surviving heir to inherit her lands. Instead of allowing imperial absorption or noble fragmentation, she redirected the future of her territories toward the papacy. It was her final strategic move. Not on a battlefield, not in a castle courtyard, but on parchment, where ink could sometimes prove as powerful as steel. In the summer of 1115, after decades of war, negotiation, and relentless political manoeuvring, Matilda of Tuscany died. She was nearly 70, an extraordinary age for someone who had lived through sieges, betrayals, imperial invasions, and the constant stress of high medieval politics. Many of her contemporaries had fallen to disease, assassination, or battlefield wounds. Matilda endured. At the time of her death, the investiture controversy, the great struggle between empire and papacy, was not yet fully resolved. That final settlement would come years later with the Concordat of Worms, but her role in sustaining the reform movement had already altered the balance of power. The immediate aftermath of her death was complicated. Her vast territories, which she had donated to the papacy, became the subject of intense legal and political dispute. Imperial forces did not simply accept papal control. Negotiations stretched across years. Control shifted. Agreements were made and challenged. Yet something irreversible had happened. The papacy now possessed not just spiritual authority, but territorial foundations strong enough to resist imperial domination. Matilda's lands became a core piece of what would later solidify as the Papal States. Her decision shaped centuries of Italian and European politics. But her legacy was not only territorial. She had demonstrated that a woman could command armies, manage estates, negotiate with emperors, and shape the destiny of Christendom, not as a temporary placeholder, but as a sustained ruler in her own right. Chroniclers remembered her as devout, formidable, unwavering. Some admired her courage. Others criticized her defiance of imperial authority. Few ignored her. Generations later, her remains would be moved to St. Peter's Basilica, a rare honour, placing her among popes and saints. It was a symbolic recognition of her lifelong alliance with Rome. Matilda did not wear a crown of empire. She did not claim the papal throne. Yet she stood between both powers and influenced them profoundly. In a century defined by towering male figures, emperors, reforming popes, rebellious princes, she carved out authority through endurance, conviction, and strategic intelligence. She did not simply witness history. She shaped it. When historians speak of the investiture controversy, they often focus on two towering figures, Pope Gregory VII and Henry IV, Pope and Emperor, crozier and crown. But between them stood Matilda of Tuscany, not symbolically, not passively, physically, politically, militarily. Her castles hosted popes, her roads blocked emperors, her armies fought imperial forces, her wealth financed reform. Her signatures altered the map of Italy. She was not a theologian drafting decrees, yet theology shaped her alliances. She was not crowned empress, yet emperors had to negotiate around her lands. She was not a nun cloistered in prayer, yet her devotion to the reform papacy defined her political life. In a century when legitimacy came from divine sanction, Matilda understood something critical. Control of territory meant control of leverage. Without her strongholds, Gregory would not have stood firm at Canossa. Without her resistance, imperial marches into Rome would have been far easier. Without her donation, the papacy's territorial base would have been weaker for generations. And yet, she ruled in a world that did not expect women to command armies. Her authority was not effortless. It required constant reinforcement. She had to maintain loyalty among nobles who might easily defect to imperial favour. She had to fund defences. She had to show strength without appearing reckless. Her endurance was her greatest weapon. Where emperors burned hot and collapsed under rebellion, she remained steady. Where popes rose and fell, she continued. She outlasted the storm. Matilda's life forces a broader question. How many other medieval women shaped events quietly, without chronicles giving them equal space? She was exceptional, yes, but she was also proof that medieval Europe was not as politically rigid as we often imagine. At the intersection of sword and scripture, ambition and faith, Matilda carved her place, not as someone's daughter, not as someone's wife, but as a ruler whose decisions influenced the fate of Christendom. And that is a legacy no crown could improve. In medieval Europe, the vast majority of people could not read the Bible. So the Bible came to them, not in quiet monasteries, not in neatly bound books, but in the middle of town squares, surrounded by shouting vendors, wandering dogs, and children climbing onto barrels for a better view. These were the medieval mystery plays. The word mystery did not mean something unsolved. It came from the Latin ministerium, meaning craft or trade. These plays were organised by town guilds, the bakers, the carpenters, the fishmongers, the blacksmiths. Each guild was assigned a biblical episode. The shipwrights often performed Noah's Ark. The bakers might stage the Last Supper. The metalworkers might handle scenes of the crucifixion. Faith met logistics. On feast days, especially Corpus Christi, entire towns transformed into sacred theatres. Wooden stages were built in public squares, or even mounted on wagons that rolled from street to street. These pageant wagons stopped at key points, performing one episode after another in a grand cycle that could last for hours, sometimes days. And this was no quiet devotional reading. Heaven was painted bright blue and gold. Hell was a gaping mouth with smoke pouring from it. Angels descended on ropes. Devils leaped, shrieked, and waved pitchforks at laughing children. Yes, laughing. Because these plays were deeply religious, but also deeply human. Biblical figures spoke in local dialects. Shepherds complained about taxes. Noah's wife sometimes refused to board the ark, and had to be dragged on stage while the crowd roared. The devil often became the comic relief, tripping, boasting, and terrifying toddlers in equal measure. The audience was not passive. They reacted. They wept during the Passion of Christ. They gasped at the Last Judgment. They booed villains. They cheered miracles. For an illiterate population, this was theology with costumes. Through drama, gesture, and spectacle, complex doctrines became understandable. Creation, fall, redemption, judgment. The entire story of salvation unfolded not in parchment, but in performance. In a world lit by candles and shaped by faith, the mystery plays did something powerful. They made scripture visible. They made doctrine emotional. And for a few unforgettable hours, they turned ordinary streets into the stage of eternity. If the Bible had taken the stage, the town itself became the theatre. Medieval mystery plays were not confined to church interiors. In fact, they often spilled deliberately into the streets. The most famous cycles, like those performed in York or Chester, transformed entire urban spaces into moving sacred dramas. The heart of the spectacle was the pageant wagon. These were large, wooden, two-level carts constructed by guilds. The lower level often served as a dressing room or storage space for costumes and props. The upper level was the stage itself. Painted backdrops suggested heaven, earth, or hell. Trapdoors allowed devils to burst upward in smoke and chaos. On performance days, the wagons rolled through town, stopping at designated stations. At each stop, the guild performed its assigned episode before moving on to the next location. Meanwhile, another wagon followed behind, presenting the next scene in the biblical timeline. Creation might unfold near the market square. The nativity might be staged beside the city gate. The crucifixion might take place just outside the cathedral. The effect was immersive. The town became Jerusalem. The marketplace became Bethlehem. The ordinary became sacred. And it was loud. Hammers had built these stages, but now drums, trumpets, and shouted lines filled the air. Actors projected their voices without microphones, competing with wind, animals, and restless crowds. Children climbed onto rooftops for a better view. Vendors paused their sales. Even skeptical townsfolk watched. The staging could be surprisingly sophisticated. Heaven was sometimes depicted as an elevated platform draped in blue and gold fabric, with angels in white robes. Hell was famously portrayed as a monstrous mouth, the hell mouth, complete with smoke, fire effects, and grotesque demons dragging the damned inside. The audience did not simply observe, they felt involved. When Christ carried the cross, the crowd fell silent. When Judas betrayed him, murmurs rippled outward. When devils capered across the stage, laughter broke the tension. These plays were not distant theology lectures. They were communal experiences. For one day, the invisible became visible, the distant became local, and sacred history walked, quite literally, through the streets. If you expect medieval religion to be solemn at all times, the mystery plays would surprise you. Yes, they dramatized creation, the fall, the nativity, the passion, and the last judgment. Yes, they were rooted deeply in Christian doctrine, but they were also full of noise, exaggeration, and laughter, especially when the devils appeared. In towns like York, the devil was not always a silent embodiment of cosmic evil. He was loud, he was boastful, he tripped over props, he mocked humans and sometimes mocked himself. He waved pitchforks and scampered across the stage, occasionally terrifying children, and delighting them at the same time. Actors playing devils often wore grotesque masks, horns, tails, and padded costumes to make them larger than life. Their movements were exaggerated. Their voices boomed. Smoke poured from the hell mouth as they dragged souls inside with theatrical enthusiasm. The crowd loved it. Comedy served a purpose. In a society where most people laboured hard and faced harsh realities, humour made heavy theology bearable. The fall of Lucifer could be terrifying, but if Lucifer also stumbled while exiting the stage, the audience could laugh before returning to the lesson. Even biblical characters were sometimes portrayed with surprising earthiness. Shepherds grumbled about cold nights and aching backs before the angelic announcement of Christ's birth. Noah's wife famously resisted boarding the ark in several versions of the play, scolding her husband and drawing laughter before reluctantly climbing aboard. To modern audiences, this mixture of sacred and comedic might seem strange, but for medieval viewers, it felt natural. Faith was not sterile, it was lived. By inserting humour, the playwrights made stories relatable. Adam and Eve argued, Roman soldiers bantered during the crucifixion. Minor characters complained about work, taxes, or neighbours. These were recognisable human reactions inside sacred narratives. The laughter did not diminish the message. If anything, it sharpened it. Because when the mood shifted, when Christ suffered, when judgment was pronounced, when heaven and hell separated the saved from the damned, the emotional impact was stronger. Comedy opened the door. Drama delivered the weight. And in those crowded squares, medieval townspeople experienced a full spectrum of feeling: fear, joy, sorrow, awe, all within a single performance. The mystery plays were not quiet meditations. They were emotional storms dressed in costume and fire. If the actors gave the mystery plays life, the craftsmen gave them spectacle. In cities like Chester and York, guild members did far more than memorize lines. They engineered heaven. They constructed hell. They turned timber, cloth, rope, and paint into visions of eternity. Heaven was usually elevated. A raised platform, draped in blue or gold fabric, represented divine space. Painted stars glittered against wooden backdrops. Angels descended using rope systems that required careful coordination and strong arms hidden behind the scenes. When an actor portraying God spoke, he often did so from above, physically reinforcing spiritual hierarchy. Hell, by contrast, was loud and theatrical. The infamous Hellmouth became one of the most iconic images of medieval drama. It was literally constructed as a monstrous mouth, jaws open wide, painted with fangs and fiery colours. Smoke effects were created using burning materials beneath or behind the stage. Sparks and noise heightened the illusion. Devils emerged from it shrieking, dragging the damned into its gaping throat. For audiences who had never seen special effects beyond torchlight, this was overwhelming. But the production demanded serious craftsmanship. Carpenters built sturdy wagon platforms capable of holding multiple actors. Blacksmiths forged chains and props. Tailors stitched elaborate robes for angels and Roman soldiers. Painters crafted backdrops that suggested cosmic drama within limited space. Each guild took pride in its assigned scene. The shipwrights might carefully construct Noah's Ark, ensuring it looked convincing enough to carry both actors and livestock props. The bakers staging the Last Supper might replicate bread and table settings with meticulous attention. This was devotion expressed through skill. Participation in a mystery play was not merely entertainment. It was an offering of labour to God. Guild members rehearsed for weeks. Scripts were memorised. Timing was coordinated between moving wagons. Mistakes could disrupt an entire cycle. And yet, the imperfections were part of the charm. Ropes tangled, costumes slipped, smoke sometimes overwhelmed actors instead of frightening the audience. But these human flaws made the divine drama strangely intimate. Heaven and hell were not abstract theological concepts. They were built from wood and sweat, and when the wagons rolled into the square and the crowd gathered, medieval townspeople saw something unforgettable. Eternity, constructed by their own neighbours. Behind every mystery play stood not just actors, but entire guilds staking their reputation on performance. In medieval cities like York, the annual play cycles were civic events as much as religious ones. Each trade guild was responsible for producing a specific episode of the biblical narrative. And this was not assigned randomly. The shipwrights traditionally performed Noah's Ark. The bakers staged the Last Supper. The butchers might handle the crucifixion. The logic was symbolic, sometimes ironic, sometimes practical. But it was always public. and that public element mattered. A guild's performance reflected its discipline, wealth, and organizational strength. A poorly staged scene suggested disorder. A magnificent one signaled prestige. Rivalries between guilds could quietly unfold in the quality of costumes, the height of their pageant wagons, or the dramatic intensity of their devils. This was faith, but it was also civic competition. Guilds funded their own productions. They purchased fabric, constructed sets, hired musicians, and sometimes even paid for professional scribes to maintain scripts. Participation required resources. That meant the plays displayed not only religious devotion, but economic power, and the entire town watched. Municipal authorities often regulated performance schedules carefully. The play cycles followed a strict order, beginning with creation and culminating in the Last Judgment. The entire arc of salvation history unfolded through cooperation between trades that, on ordinary days, competed in the marketplace. For one festival, rivalry transformed into collaboration. The audience saw more than scripture. They saw their community embodied. The carpenter playing Joseph might be the same man who repaired your roof. The angel descending from heaven might be the apprentice who delivered bread to your home. The devil leaping from the hellmouth could be the blacksmith you argued with over a horseshoe last month. Sacred drama blurred with civic identity. Participation also reinforced hierarchy. Wealthier guilds could afford grander effects. Smaller trades sometimes struggled to meet expectations. Yet all were bound into the same sacred narrative. The mystery plays were not just religious theatre. They were public declarations of belonging. To act was to affirm your place in the town's moral and economic order. And for one charged, noisy, unforgettable day, commerce and salvation walked hand in hand through the streets. For all the laughter, smoke, and comic devils, the mystery plays were not light entertainment. At their heart lay something far more serious: judgment. The cycle almost always ended with the Last Judgment. After creation, the flood, the nativity, the passion, and the resurrection, the story moved toward its final and most unsettling scene. Christ returned not as a suffering figure, but as a judge. In cities such as York, this final pageant could be overwhelming. Heaven was staged high above. Christ sat enthroned, radiant and authoritative. Angels flanked him. Trumpets sounded to summon the dead from their graves. Below, chaos unfolded. The dead rose, sometimes literally climbing from trapdoors or symbolic tombs. Devils surged from the hellmouth, eager and theatrical. The saved were guided gently toward heaven. The damned were dragged screaming toward the monstrous jaws of hell. The contrast was stark. For medieval audiences, this was not distant metaphor. It was personal. Life expectancy was uncertain. Disease, famine, and war were familiar realities. Death was not abstract. It was visible, frequent, and near. Watching neighbours perform the separation of souls forced uncomfortable reflection. Am I ready? Am I saved? Have I confessed? The emotional tone shifted sharply from earlier humour. Laughter faded. Children quieted. Even the most restless spectators felt the gravity of the scene. And yet, there was hope. Christ extended mercy. Repentant sinners could be redeemed. The Virgin and saints sometimes interceded. The message was not pure terror. It was moral urgency. The plays functioned as public sermons without a pulpit. For an illiterate audience, theology became visual instruction. The consequences of sin were not described in Latin texts. They were enacted in smoke and rope and shouting voices. But here is the key. Fear was not meant to paralyze. It was meant to reform. The mystery plays reminded townspeople that daily actions mattered eternally. Business dealings, honesty, charity, prayer, all fed into the final reckoning dramatized before their eyes. After the devils dragged away the condemned and heaven's gates closed gently behind the saved, the audience dispersed into ordinary life. But they carried the images with them: the hellmouth, the throne, the dividing line. And for many, That memory lingered long after the wagons rolled away. The mystery plays did not begin in the marketplace. They began inside the church. In the early Middle Ages, small liturgical dramas were performed by clergy during major feast days. Short dialogues in Latin, such as the Quem Quaeritis trope at Easter, were inserted into services. A priest portraying the angel at Christ's tomb would ask, "Whom do you seek?" Other clergy responded as the women visiting the tomb. It was simple, brief, devotional. But it grew. Over time, these small dramatic moments expanded. More characters were added. Costumes appeared. Movement increased. The audience, originally just the congregation, became more engaged. Eventually, the church walls could no longer contain the spectacle. As scripts grew longer and scenes multiplied, performances moved outdoors. Latin gradually gave way to local languages. The clergy ceded control to lay guilds and municipal authorities. Sacred drama left the altar and entered the street. This transition was not without tension. Church officials sometimes worried that performances were becoming too crude, too comic, too theatrical. When devils slipped on stage, or Noah's wife argued loudly with her husband, some clergy questioned whether sacred stories were being trivialized. But the popularity was undeniable. In towns like Chester, civic authorities embraced the plays as major public festivals. They drew crowds, strengthened community identity, and reinforced Christian doctrine in accessible form. The shift from church to street represented something larger, the merging of sacred and civic life. Faith was no longer confined to Latin liturgy recited by priests. It became participatory, visible, shared by bakers, carpenters, and blacksmiths. And this mattered deeply in a society structured around collective identity. When townspeople staged creation or the Passion, they were not just observing theology, they were embodying it. Sacred history became something enacted by familiar faces. The movement outdoors also democratized access. Those who never entered church regularly still encountered scripture in the square. Travellers passing through town witnessed salvation history unfolding between market stalls. By stepping beyond church walls, the mystery plays did not weaken faith, they expanded its reach, and in doing so, they transformed medieval streets into temporary cathedrals, roofless, noisy, and unforgettable. For centuries, the mystery plays flourished, but nothing in medieval Europe remained untouched by change. By the 15th and 16th centuries, religious tension across Europe intensified. Criticism of church practices grew louder. Reform movements questioned authority, ritual, and doctrine. The same public performances that once unified towns now became vulnerable to suspicion. In England, where play cycles in cities like York had once drawn enormous crowds, the Protestant Reformation changed everything. Reformers criticised what they saw as excessive theatricality and superstition. Some argued that dramatising sacred events risked irreverence. Others objected to theological elements embedded in the scripts, particularly scenes emphasising purgatory, saintly intercession, or elaborate depictions of heaven and hell. Municipal leaders faced pressure. Under Protestant monarchs, certain Catholic doctrines were outlawed. Public religious drama suddenly became politically dangerous. Scripts were revised, scenes were cut. References to controversial doctrines were removed or softened. In some towns, the plays adapted. They became shorter, less overtly theological, more moralistic than sacramental. But adaptation was not always enough. Gradually, performances were banned outright. The pageant wagons fell silent. Costumes were stored away. Guild responsibilities shifted back toward trade rather than theatre. This decline did not happen overnight. In some places, cycles lingered longer than in others. But by the late 16th century, the grand civic mystery plays had largely disappeared from English streets. Ironically, as they faded, another theatrical tradition was rising. Professional theatre companies began performing secular dramas in purpose-built venues. Playwrights like William Shakespeare would soon transform English drama. While Shakespeare's works were not mystery plays, they emerged in a culture already accustomed to public performance, elaborate staging, and emotionally charged storytelling. The mystery plays had laid groundwork. They trained communities in spectacle. They demonstrated the power of drama to move crowds. They proved that performance could carry profound ideas. When religious reform reshaped Europe, the pageant wagons disappeared. But the theatrical instinct remained. Sacred drama gave way to secular storytelling. And though the hellmouth closed and the angels no longer descended on ropes in public squares, the legacy of medieval performance continued, quietly influencing the stage for generations to come. When the pageant wagons stopped rolling and the hellmouth fell silent, the mystery plays did not simply vanish into nostalgia. They had already done their work. For medieval townspeople, these performances were not optional entertainment. They were communal catechism. In an age when literacy was limited and manuscripts were rare, drama carried doctrine. Through gesture, costume, and spectacle, entire populations absorbed the narrative arc of creation, fall, redemption, and judgment. But their significance went deeper. The mystery plays turned theology into shared memory. A sermon might be forgotten, a written text might be inaccessible, but the image of a neighbour playing Christ, the sound of devils shouting from the hellmouth, the sight of angels descending on ropes, those lingered. They also blurred boundaries between sacred and civic life, between clergy and laity, between fear and laughter, between doctrine and daily reality. For one festival day, a town did not simply attend church, it became part of the story. Bakers and blacksmiths embodied scripture. Children watched eternal drama unfold beside market stalls. Judgment and salvation were staged where bread was sold and contracts negotiated. That merging of worlds mattered. It reinforced a worldview in which faith was not confined to Sunday ritual. It was woven into trade, governance, humour, and public identity. The plays also reveal something crucial about medieval culture. It was not silent, stiff, or uniformly solemn. It was imaginative, theatrical, capable of holding deep reverence and earthy comedy in the same space. Devils could make people laugh. Christ could make them weep. And both reactions served the same moral purpose. Even after religious reforms ended many performances, their influence persisted. Later, European theatre inherited their love of spectacle, strong character types, and moral tension. Public drama as a civic experience did not begin with Renaissance playwrights. It had already thrived in muddy town squares. Today, surviving scripts and records remind us that medieval communities were not passive recipients of doctrine. They actively staged it. They built heaven from timber. They constructed hell from paint and smoke. And for a few vivid hours each year, they transformed ordinary streets into the stage of eternity. That is why the mystery plays still matter, not as relics, but as proof that storytelling has always been one of humanity's most powerful tools for shaping belief, identity, and memory.